Hi, I'm Victoria Oldridge with Truffld.com and speaking today about a really important topic that I think a number of us are probably somewhat aware of. Many of us are not at all. And fortunately, we have attorney, author of the book Exposure, whose story inspired the film Dark Waters, Dr. Robert Bilott with us. And we're going to speak about the polyfluoroalkyl class of chemicals, also known as PFAS. So I had a little bit of awareness initially. I was always aware of the name PFAS, but I dug in a little bit more last year when I wrote a reported piece for BBC News about the effects of PFAS, which is in firefighter foam and has been for many years, and the links that we're finding now to cancer, at least recognizing that are linked to cancer. And so I took a deeper dive there. But when I came across the film Dark Waters, that was a much deeper dive that I took, which was really eye-opening. And then more recently had read your book, Exposure. So, I'd like to dig in first. I'd like to give a little bit of background in terms of the real deleterious effects of these chemicals. They're essentially ubiquitous. They're in everything. They're in everything from our drinking water, which is what Rob highlighted in his trajectory over the past 2 decades in going up against companies like Dupont and 3M and a host of other companies that have known for the past 50 plus years that these chemicals have been put into our drinking waters. But it's also in anything from mascara to waterproof clothing to our furniture, fast food wrappers. It really is everywhere. And so I think it's really important that we bring as much awareness to this as possible. And I'd like to dig in with you. One other point, these chemicals are also biopersistent and they're bioaccumulative. So basically what that's saying is they're not biodegradable. They cannot be destroyed. They can't be broken down. And so once they're in our systems, which they are in over 99% of Americans and much of the planet, they're accumulating over time, and there's really not a way to break these carbon atom bonds, which are very strong. So would you mind giving a little bit of synopsis of and I know we're covering 20 years here in a couple of minutes, so at least some of the highlights of what you've accomplished, which have been phenomenal, in supporting these victims, where we're now seeing the links to cancer and a host of other physical ailments.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, because as you indicated, this is a massive, frankly, public health threat that went pretty much unnoticed, and not many folks were even talking about this. This is something that's been going on for the last 70 years, not only here in the United States, but frankly, all over the world. And we're only just now becoming aware of this contamination. You hear it referred to as an emerging chemical class. In fact, the only thing emerging is our awareness of it. Yeah, these chemicals have been out there. They were invented right after World War II. And now, as you indicated, we're talking about an entire class of chemicals that are completely man-made, never existed on the planet prior to the World War II. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these chemicals in this class of PFAS, and they share this common bond, as you mentioned, of having this unusual carbon-fluorine chemical bond, which makes them very difficult to break down under natural conditions in the environment. That's why you hear them referred to as forever chemicals, because once they get out there, they stay virtually forever. And even though we're all the public, scientists, regulators are just now starting to learn about this, the companies that made and used these unfortunately knew a lot about them and withheld a lot of this information from the rest of us for many years. And what you see in the movie Dark Waters, what you see in the documentary The Devil We Know, where I try to discuss in the book Exposure, is what it took to bring information out to the public just about one of these chemicals, PFOA. And that's the one we probably have the best information on as far as what the potential types of health effects are. And it's very disturbing. We're talking about a chemical that has been used in so many different applications, not just Teflon or nonstick cookware, but as you mentioned, in so many different variety of materials, stain resistant waterproof clothing and carpeting and fast food wrappers and packaging and firefighting foams. And the related chemical, PFOS, was used in Scotchgard and certain types of firefighting foams as well. And these chemicals were in so many different products, and they've managed to get out into water all over the planet, soil all over the planet, in the blood of all of us. And the science, though, is showing us that at least with PFOA, they've been confirmed through some of the massive, the biggest human health studies ever done, as you see in the film, showing links with kidney, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol. And the list, unfortunately, continues to grow from researchers who are now looking at the immune impacts. These PFOA and some of these PFOS chemicals have been shown to decrease vaccine response and decrease our immunity here while we're dealing with a massive pandemic. So it's very disturbing. And as this information is finally coming out and people are starting to realize the scope and extent of this problem, it's not just the one community that we were dealing with in West Virginia or the one farmer and his family in West Virginia. It's now everywhere. And litigation is popping up all over the country, all over the world about this, because the costs to clean it up, to get this stuff out of our water, to get it out of our soil is astronomical, let alone how do we get it out of us and how do we get it out of our babies who are being born with these chemicals in them at birth. So it's become a huge worldwide problem, one that's being finally discussed at state legislative levels, and the federal level for the first time, really. We're starting to have these discussions at the UN, at the EU, people trying to find out how do we approach this on a global basis, because this is a global contamination of really unprecedented scale.
Stop. That basically in 2015, one of the byproducts of some of your class action suits and all of the work that you put forth over the past couple of decades resulted in 2015, where Dupont, I believe 3M and other chemical companies has started to phase out PFOS. The other negative side effect to that is that they then replaced it with something that has a 4-carbon chain molecular structure called, they've named Gen X. And apparently this Gen X revised version that they're still putting into, and this, by the way, Dupont has spun off a company, one of its companies, I think it's Chemours, is that what it's called? Chemours. And that's producing this Gen X molecule. So where do we go from there? It looks like it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another.
Well, you've hit on a very, very important point, and one that's really frustrating legislators and regulators and scientists all over the planet, which is, we finally, when this information finally started coming out and the US EPA finally started to see some of this internal data about these chemicals, you had 3M announce that they were going to stop making them. And then Dupont jumped in, unfortunately, began making one of them, PFOA, for several years before they finally announced after this litigation that they would phase out making PFOA. And 8 companies assigned that. They would agree to stop making it in the United States. And that announcement was back in 2006. And what you had was a 10-year phase out. And what was happening is while those chemicals that we knew the most about, PFOA and PFOS, the ones that had 8 carbons called C8s, while those were being phased out, and we finally started to understand the health risks of those chemicals, the companies just basically started tweaking them a bit, knocking a couple of carbons off. And they, instead of C8s, making things like C6s and C4s, and started putting those into products all over the world and rolling those out in sort of a quiet way during this 10-year period of phase out. One of those, as you mentioned, was DuPont's replacement for PFOA, their replacement for the C8 chemical. They called it Gen X, a C6, and they started making that down in North Carolina. And sure enough, unfortunately, by 2016 or so, chemical was being found in the drinking water of thousands of people in North Carolina. And it's almost like we played this whack-a-mole game. As we finally had information that was sufficient to start regulating and banning couple of these chemicals, you simply tweak them a bit, call them something new, and say, oh, all that science, that related to these other chemicals. It has nothing about this new one, and there's nothing to say we can't continue making this, and this process then starts all over again. So you now see scientists and regulators all over advocating to address this almost like as a class of chemicals, like we did with PCBs, or dioxins, to address them all together as opposed to just every individual one. And there's a huge debate going on right now in the scientific world about what's the best approach. But clearly the way we've been doing it, taking 20 years of science and then allowing essentially all of us to be the human guinea pigs during that time frame to see how many people get cancer, how many people get sick. And then only after that happens, take steps to try to stop it. There are folks that are saying we need to be doing things proactively to prevent those types of exposures from going forward in the future. So this, luckily, if one good thing has come from this story, it's people becoming aware that we've got some real serious problems in the way we address chemicals and in the way things are brought out onto the market.
The question though still is, are we addressing them? I mean, you've kind of been, I know you've had support and you would attribute a lot of that to the law firm that you still work for that supported you as well, but you've largely been a one-man show for over 2 decades. And really there hasn't been any support even from our Environmental Protection Agency, the legislative level. Like you mentioned, this is only percolating more now, and in part probably because of the media attention that's being increasingly drawn to this issue. But we're being slowly poisoned, basically. And we have been for a long time. Some others, unfortunately, more quickly poisoned, dependent on the level of exposure that they have. But why is it's just frustrating as, and I can't even imagine how frustrating it is for you if it's frustrating for me. But why isn't the EPA doing more, and why have things been gated so much at the legislative level? And I say that also because I know that there was a bill, the Forever Chemicals bill, it was dubbed this last year, brought forth. And from what I understand, the latest on that was that President Trump had vetoed it or had planned to. So can you get us up to speed a little bit on other than your, Herculean efforts, what other support are we getting?
I first wrote to the EPA in March of 2001. And naively at the time thought that would start this process of the EPA coming in and regulating this chemical that was in the drinking water of thousands of people. And that process is still going on. It has been 20 years, and there is still not an actual binding federal standard for this, even one of these chemicals, not even PFOA, where you have these massive human health studies. That is still technically not regulated in drinking water at the federal level in the United States. And states are having to move forward and do this on their own while this incredibly complicated, slow process moves through the US EPA. And what I try to explore in the book, Exposure, is why that happens and what the effects of that are, particularly on the communities who are exposed, how it's almost impossible to move through this regulatory system to get a chemical regulated. Even when you've got a chemical like PFOA, where you've got the most comprehensive human health studies probably on any chemical ever done, and we still can't move it through that process. How this system is set up that really puts the burden on the people who are exposed to have to prove the harmfulness of the chemicals, and establishes these burdens that are almost impossible for exposed people to meet, of having to have these massive studies that are big enough to show these health effects that typically require tens of thousands of people and millions of dollars. And this case with PFOA, as you see in the film Dark Waters, was one of the only times we've done that, where the community was actually able to meet that burden. And really in the book, I try to talk about why that happens and how the scientific process, how papers are published, how the journals are controlled by certain entities, how this regulatory process interplays with that, and the politics that are involved. How all of that meshes with this legal system that results in a situation like this, where you've got a chemical that's widely recognized now as being toxic, as being persistent, that'll stay in us. that builds up over time, that can cause cancer in humans, yet it's still not regulated. So it's unfortunately a complicated answer, but it's really a systemic problem, and one that's gone on for decades through multiple administrations. I don't see it necessarily as a red or blue issue. It is a systemic problem in the way in which our system is set up to regulate these chemicals in the United States.
And do you think, to that point, that it's just the regulatory side, or is the other part of the equation also the fact that in our country, I mean, corporations just, quite frankly, have quite a sizable lobbying effort that's intertwined with our government?
It's definitely a difficult burden for those in the communities to meet, and to particularly to go up against some of these, incredibly sophisticated parties that have, some of the world's best scientists, some of the best lawyers, some of the best PR and media firms. And, if you look at this story with one of these chemicals, PFOA, what really began to change that dynamic is when the public finally started to learn about it, when you were able to finally break through the ability of the company to completely control the narrative and to control the facts, and to be able to finally start getting information out onto the internet, onto websites, people like the Environmental Working Group, who were able to start posting actual documents so people could see for themselves what was really going on. That changed the dynamic, and really things began to change when the facts and the actual information finally began to be disseminated to the public.
Now, before you had taken on this case, which was brought on to you by the Tennant family, going back, I think, 22 years ago or so now, 23 years.
Yes.
You were sitting on the side of defending the chemical companies, and this case that was brought up, and now you switched to the plaintiff side, and really kind of gave you a change of heart and seeing things at both ends of the spectrum. How has taking on this 22 plus year case, sitting on the side of the plaintiff, changed the way that you practice law or adopt certain cases since that time?
Well, it certainly opened my eyes to sort of what I would call the holes or the gaps, in our legal system, where, when I first started out practicing, I didn't have much scientific background. I was learning all the federal and state environmental laws when I began my practice in 1990. And I thought I understood it pretty well. And I thought I understood, that if you had something dangerous or harmful or toxic, it was on a list and it was regulated. And as long as you were meeting the standards that have been set by the regulatory agencies, you were doing okay. And if you were working with a company that was trying to figure out whether they could emit something into the air or into the water or put it into a landfill, you had to make sure that you were not dealing with certain things on certain lists. And as long as you were working within that system, things were okay. And really, it was with Mr. Tennant walking through my door in 1998 that really opened my eyes to how large of a world there is outside of what is regulated and listed and identified. And really, in order to address those issues, we kind of had to go back to some of the ancient common law concepts, things like trespass and nuisance, that thou shalt not cause harm on my property, whether it's regulated or listed or on some list or not. And really had to come up with new ways, innovative ways to try to address harms that really our legal system had not caught up with. The science had advanced faster than what the legal concepts really were dealing with. So as a lawyer, presented some pretty significant challenges, but really some interesting and fascinating opportunities too.
So just the question then still is, are you still defending chemical companies, or do you do it differently through a different lens than maybe you had before since taking on the plaintiff side? Or I'm just curious as to, because you've done such a great job being able to kind of straddle both sides and understand them so well now, that I wonder if the way that you support, if you do defend chemical companies, is just done in a different kind of trajectory.
Well, I guess I don't necessarily view it as sides. I see it as clients that have particular needs, and I think, whether you're working with somebody who's bringing a lawsuit against somebody or working with the person who's defending against that, I think both of those makes you a much better lawyer because you understand what the interests are on both sides, what the concerns are, what the needs are from both perspectives. And really, you have to understand and really listen to, what's going on both sides. I'm at the same law firm that I've been at now. This is my year 30 at the Taft Law Firm in Cincinnati. And I'm still doing a lot of work for folks who have been injured by these chemicals. And now that includes some companies who've been injured by these chemicals as well, who also weren't told, that the materials they were purchasing were harmful or could cause harm if they use them. I don't necessarily see it as, one side or the other. It's a spectrum of people and clients that have unique needs that you need to address as best you can.
So what can we do at a grassroots level? For those of us who feel kind of helpless, the helpless consumer, if you're struggling and you're not struggling, but you know what I'm saying, where you've amassed immense data over the past 20 years and successful class action suits, and we're still trying to see things bubble up to the legislative level. So the rest of us at this level feel like, what can we do? So what can we do not only to take some more proactive measures to help things propel forward, but also what can we do on a day-to-day basis to protect our health?
Well, I think one of the primary things is talk about these issues. Actually, don't assume that somebody else is taking care of all this for you. That obviously somebody's not going to let me have something dangerous in my water, or obviously somebody is regulating what chemicals go into our environment. You've got to take personal responsibility of talking about these issues, raising the concerns, and making sure that what you assume is happening is actually happening. And that's one of the things I think I'm hoping that when people see this story in particular, with Mr. Tennant, who was able to stand up against a massive company, who said, look, I think something very seriously wrong is happening here, and we're going to stop it. And he was able to do it. Community along the Ohio River was able to come together, stand up, speak out, and essentially help change the rest of the world. Do studies that everyone now is benefiting from. So I'm hoping that people are able to realize that they can, on an individual basis, a community basis, they have incredible power to make unbelievable change. And don't just assume, because it's always been done this way, that's the way we've got to do it. There are plenty of opportunities to make new law, to pursue new ideas, new theories on how to get things done. And that's one of the reasons I wrote that book, Exposure, was to try to say, this is how this mess happened. And these are all these factors that led to this. Here's how we got here. And hopefully people will be able to see that and come up with some great ideas about how we fix it going forward. There are a number of groups out there that have formed, particularly with the rollout of the film, Dark Waters. For example, FightForEverChemicals.com was launched with the film Dark Waters, where different community groups across the country that are dealing with these chemicals in their drinking water, have teamed up with different NGOs and environmental groups to try to make information available to people. Most of us, we had no idea we were being exposed to these chemicals. We had no idea which products these things were in. And it's still incredibly difficult to find that information and to know which companies use this stuff and which products have it, which products don't. A lot of it's still being claimed as confidential business information. So there are groups that are out there, the Environmental Working Group, Green Science Policy Institute, Center for Environmental Health, and just to name a few, that are trying to post information about here's where these chemicals have been used in the past. Here are companies that are switching away that have come out and very publicly made pledges to not use them anymore, to try to encourage the market forces, to help us move away from these things. So, as an individual, that's one of your most powerful tools too, is to help encourage the market to say, we don't want these anymore, and we want to support folks that are moving away from them.
Chemical. I just read that recently. I think the word fluoro or fluorine should be present on certain products, but nonetheless, it's still like finding a needle in a haystack and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch late night television, you might see, for example, cookware, you see it advertised PFOA free. Well, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean PFAS free. It may have some of the replacement chemicals in it. And there's a lot of concern now that some of these replacements may have similar toxicities, or may affect us in different ways that the other ones didn't. So you've got to, as a consumer, you just have to be very careful about the language that's used. And PFOA is just one of the PFAS chemicals.
Yeah, one of 4,000 or 5,000. So, and there's only really been a couple that have been studied. So, I mean, there's a lot that we don't know. But
well, there's only a couple that we know about, the studies that were done. Right. Think about it. It took 20 years for us to dig out and reveal the fact that there was a lot known about PFOA and even PFOS. It simply wasn't shared with the rest of the world. Who knows what information is already out there in some of these others that we just don't know about yet.
Well, let's look forward to progress, continued progress. You've made a lot of headway in a couple of decades. It's been an uphill battle, but I think there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel here. The more awareness, the better. So, Rob Bilott, thank you for your efforts. I loved Dark Waters, and I enjoyed your book as well very much. You really get into the granularity of what it takes to go to trial, what it took to circumvent and dig and again, find needles in the haystack where you didn't know they were in the law that you had to try to navigate freshly. So thank you. And yeah.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, this is, it's incredibly important to have these discussions like we had today. And I thank you for helping to spread awareness of this story. It continues to be a public health threat that's unfortunately been still going fairly unnoticed and unrecognized through much of the world. So I appreciate what you're doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our audience, please subscribe at Truffld.com to see this when it runs. And we thank you again.